Will Rogers, in a 1933 newspaper column, says, you know, they say that Hitler's imitating Mussolini, but he doesn't look like he wants to be emperor. He looks like he wants to be Kliegel.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Maine to New York City. As if the Syrian refugees haven't had enough problems, drenching rains are flooding their tents. In this video, a person is almost swept away. For more information, contact the Union of Medical and Relief Organizations. Now photos from days of protest against the abominable war against the people of Yemen. The New York City action is led by people who have been fasting since the last days of 2018. Remember, it's not only the Saudi and UAE doing the killing. The Saudi regime leads an entire hoodlum coalition. Here, protesters stand in front of the Qatar consulate to the United Nations. Then, on January 3rd, in front of a number of Western consulates. They were arrested in front of the U.S. consulate. Here they go to the corporate offices of Lockheed on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. One Lockheed bomb killed 44 people on a bus last year. The protesters wear facsimiles of the blue UNICEF backpacks that the murdered children were wearing. Ending with a quick picture in Grand Central Station. From Yemen, a short hop to Sudan. This is a tweet from Dala Haj Omar about the devastating article in the New York Times about Sudanese sent by dictator al-Bashir to fight in Yemen. David Kirkpatricks, the article's principal author, wrote, at any time for nearly 4 years, as many as 14,000 Sudanese militiamen have been fighting in Yemen in tandem with the local militia aligned with the Saudis. Kirkpatrick's team interviewed fighters who said that 20 to 40% of these Sudanese fighters are children, youths in their middle teens. Almost all of these Sudanese are Janajweed. Janajweed. Does that word ring a bell? How about Darfur? The Janajweed was the militia that the dictator of Sudan sent into the Darfur region of Sudan. Some years ago, they committed thousands of killings, perhaps genocide. Here's another point in the article. The Saudi commanders order about the Sudanese fighters from the rear. They use radio and cell phones and such to give orders. The Sudanese do the fighting and the dying. One Sudanese ex-fighter said about the Saudi officers, they treat the Sudanese like they're firewood. We'll link to the full article in our Yemen archive on thestruggle.org. We continue to organize to get American unions to support the Texas teacher who was fired for refusing to sign the anti-BDS pledge. We are gathering signers of an open letter to union officials. At this stage, we're trying to get union members to be the first signers. Read about all this at newpolitics.org. We'll link to the article at our site, thestruggle.org. And a short video from the only democracy in the Middle East. Jews on the right walk on a road. Palestinians on the left walk on a dirt and rocky path. Israel, 20th century apartheid. Rashida Tlaib, the first Palestinian woman elected to the U.S. Congress, has taken up her post wearing traditional Palestinian dress. Tweet Your Thobe is trending. Now more of the talk by Jason Stanley, philosophy professor at Yale University, about his book, How Fascism Works, with Trump speculating about bypassing Congress by declaring a state of emergency. We should listen extremely carefully to this examination of fascism.
So liberty requires truth. We don't think that people who've been lied to are free. Similarly, equality requires truth, because equality in liberal democracy is not full equality, economic equality. It's political equality, the capacity to speak truth to power. And speaking truth to power requires truth. So both liberty and equality require truth. So if you're going to smash liberal democracy, you need to smash truth. And in general, if you have a system based on power, then the opposition to that is truth, because truth is its own kind of power. In a system based on truth, truth is the power, not you, not your self-interest. So there's an old philosophical debate about how to respond to Thrasymachus, how to respond to despotism. Now, modern day fascism is not just Thrasymachus. It's not just the despot. Modern day fascism is a slightly beefed up animal. It requires the 19th century, it requires Fichte's Die Rede an der deutschen Nation, it requires nationalism. It's not just the leader, it's the leader plus the nation. But nevertheless, its central core, its truth-destroying central core, is something that philosophers have been familiar with since Plato, at least. In the book, I go through, the book is not about fascist policies. It's about fascist propaganda and rhetoric. I think that, so as a philosopher, I'm familiar with the battles between truth, between liberal democracy, and between power, and its antithesis, power. But you do need to look at recent history to see the modern versions of fascism, but I think it's not just philosophers need to be. This book differs in two ways from the literature, from other literature. First of all, historians tend to tend to start from particular times and places, because historians are like that. But right now what we're seeing is a transnational fascist movement, like we saw in the 20s and 30s, with universal fascism. We're seeing a transnational fascist movement that's connected. Netanyahu and Putin met for like 10 hours, I think. I mean, my partner and I can't even be together in the same room for 10 hours. So we have Steve Bannon creating the movement in Europe with already the Italian Five-Star movement behind him. We have, it turns out Steve Bannon has been advising Bolsonaro in Brazil. So we have these movements all linked. Orban is linked to Putin, is linked to Law and Justice. They're linked to Seehofer, the far right in Seehofer's in CSU, but he's an anti-immigrant. He's harshly anti-immigrant. These movements are all linked. And of course, Putin famously is linked to all of them. Now, my book differs. So recently we've seen a bunch of books, which I think of as the crisis of democracy literature. And the crisis of democracy literature overlaps with my thinking to a large extent. But my thinking crucially differs from it, because what you find in the crisis of democracy literature, perhaps the most, I think, problematic example of this being Madeleine Albright's book, is this idea that the United States is this thriving liberal democracy, and it's being invaded by this foreign European ideology of fascism. Oh no, we fought it before, we'll fight it again. And, as if fascism is foreign to the United States. My book is based in, if there's any history my book is based on, first and foremost, it's US history. It's our own history of racism that deeply influenced Nazi Germany, our own history of anti-immigrant sentiment that deeply influenced Nazi Germany. Hitler's Mein Kampf is about the construction of a national state. The idea is to tear down the semblance of a sort of bureaucratic state, destroy the state and replace it with a national state, which is a group of people unified by the fact that they're all Aryans and they're all self-sufficient, and they all decide to work for a common cause together as self-sufficient, independent Aryans, and that common cause is their Aryan national identity. And the state he takes as his model is the United States. So he has this one passage where, he has many passages, both in Mein Kampf and in Hitler's second book. He takes the United States as a model for many reasons. But he says, in one passage in Mein Kampf in particular, he says, the country that is my model, he starts off the passage by saying, around the world we are laughed upon and we are laughed about for our immigration policies, which are the mockery of the world. We allow everyone in. He said, and then he says, there's one country, however, that has wise counsel in its immigration policies, and as a result is making the initial steps towards a national state in the sense that I describe here. That is not our pattern German republic, but I mean the United States of America, which in its immigration policies has restricted its laws to allow only the finest racial stock in. He's speaking of the 1924 Immigration Act, praised by Attorney General Jeff Sessions, which only allows the finest Aryan stock in. So think of the president's remark about shithole countries and how come we don't get any immigration from Norway anymore? How come it's only shithole countries? So Hitler says, they only allow, so the 1924 Immigration Act was designed to restrict immigration, Asian immigration, that was also in the 19th century, to restrict African American, to African immigration, all immigration other than Northern European immigration, essentially. Keeping Jews out. So Hitler praises this, and he also notes that the Immigration Act restricted immigrants from a health point of view, which they're now doing again. They're now very strongly restricting. They said, we only want healthy immigrants. They're even using that language. So the United States, Nancy MacLean's 1994 book, Behind the Veil of Chivalry, about the Ku Klux Klan, discusses the ways in which the Ku Klux Klan affects Nazi Germany. The Ku Klux Klan, Nazi Germany are both, the idea was to protect womanhood against, pure womanhood, Aryan womanhood, against the threat of mixing. Many other overlaps. Will Rogers, in a 1933 newspaper column, says, they say that Hitler's imitating Mussolini, but he doesn't look like he wants to be emperor. He looks like he wants to be Kliegel. So, explicit reference to the KKK. So, and of course, my colleague Jim Whitman's book, Hitler's American Model, is about how the Nuremberg laws were based upon our anti-miscegenation laws, except for the fact that they were looked at us and they were like, no, one drop, that's untethered from reality. That's madness. Let's go with 1/8. Okay, so let me quickly describe the structure of fascist politics and fascist ideology in the 10 chapters in this book with that background. So my book, I draw on Nazi Germany, I draw on Putin's Russia, I draw on Mussolini, and I draw on the 1920s, 1930s in the United States. I draw on what I take to be very strong antecedents to fascism, the Confederacy. You find in the American South, you find whites talking about protecting the homeland from northern invaders. So you find this kind of hyper-nationalism. You find a lot of the elements of fascism. So I think that modern day fascism has a lot of antecedents, and although it coalesces in sort of a natural social kind in the mid-20th century, you can see very clear antecedents all the way dating back in the history of philosophy, but very clearly, you don't really get modern day fascism unless you have hysteria about communists. You don't have modern day fascism unless people are saying universities are filled with cultural Marxists and feminists, and that really doesn't happen until the 20th century. It's not like in the Confederacy people were complaining about universities' gender studies programs. So there's certain, the protocols of the Elders of Zion is kind of required, like, liberalism is the enemy, Marxism and liberalism. So when there's no threat of Marxism before Marxism, you don't really get, Goebbels says, the ordinary burgher will not run into our arms unless they're fearful of the Bolsheviks coming to steal their property. So what they did, what you do in fascist propaganda is you represent the center-left movement as socialists. So we're safe because this would never happen here. But what Goebbels is saying is that you should call the center-left party, the SPD, Bolsheviks. You should say they're communists and they're coming to take your property. And then you'll get people to flee into the arms of the Nazis, which is what happened. The SPD support plummeted as the Nazi Party made people terrified of encroaching communism by painting the center-left as communists. So in William Sheridan Allen's book, which studies one town that went from SPD to Nazi in 5 years, he talks about this process of repeatedly painting the towns, repeatedly painting the center left as dangerous communists. Another thing I want to mention before I just run through quickly the 10 points is another tactic we're seeing. Like, people are acting now like the attacks on university campuses, oh my God, they're not allowing right-wing speakers into campus. Anyone ever hear that? So as if that's new. And if student protests against that are new, I mean, that is like absurd. If you read the Nazi literature on National Socialism, I mean, in William Sheridan Allen's book, I'm forgetting the title right now, but if someone can Google it maybe, but he talks about the ultranationalists, the Völkische Parteien, would put on ultranationalist plays, and the students would march down from the university and battle them with bricks on the street. Students facing ultranationalists is not new. That's what students do. And the Nazi trick is to get the ultranationalists into the university by saying, you know, oh, well, we have to, the Nazi trick, the fascist trick is always this. Think about it, yeah, I think it's better, rather than going through the 10 chapters, let me explain a couple classic fascist tricks. So here's a classic fascist trick with conspiracy theories. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. You say, the newspapers are controlled by the Jews, and you know it because the newspapers don't say they're controlled by the Jews. So then the newspapers are pressured to say, oh, well, okay, I guess this person's Jewish. And then it gives credence to the view that the newspapers are controlled by the Jews. Similarly, you say the universities are controlled by the communists. You know it because the fascists aren't allowed to talk, or whatever. I mean, not just that. You know it because whatever acts, you know, I mean, I'm talking about in the 20s and 30s. It's a little different in Germany because a lot of the universities were there were many ultranationalist universities. So the structure of the relationship between the universities and but you see this in Eastern Europe right now. The universities are controlled by the leftists because they don't allow us in. And then you allow them in. And then, of course, it gives this extra legitimacy. I mean, right now, Charles Murray, who is not, you know, Charles Murray is not some superstar academic, is giving like 400 talks in every university in the country. He's being brought around. You know, he goes from NYU to Princeton to Yale to give talks. Why? You know, just to, you know, well, first of all, it's a provocation, which is part of this politics. You provoke, and then you say, look at all the leftists. You raise panic about the leftists. And you use the universities, you use moments to create panic, and you create panic in the population that the leftists are taking over. The leftists control the media. Jews, leftists, it doesn't really make a difference. Cultural Marxists. You raise panic that the institutions like the universities and the media are controlled by them, and then you get people into a panic. And you say, see, you need a strong hand. So let me quickly run through the. That's a classic tactic. I begin How Propaganda Works with a quote from Goebbels. Usually, I start most of my dinner parties that way. Where Goebbels says it's something like, it would be the greatest joke of democracy that its freedoms led to the victory of its worst enemy, by which he means, of course, freedom of speech. That doesn't mean I'm against freedom of speech, but I am very much for understanding history and understanding the riskiness of the system of democracy. I am very committed to the system of democracy. I'm very pro free speech, but I'm also very pro not being a fool about what can be done with free speech. And what happens when panic is spread about leftists controlling institutions? Because that's how this, you know, leftists controlling the media, leftists controlling Hollywood, leftists controlling the decadent art of Vienna. So that's the modern way. That's the way in which fascism differs from, say, what you find in the Confederacy and what you find before. In that it has this weird dance with leftism and Marxism. It works by creating a panic of institutions controlled by Marxists, by leftists, by communists. Okay, I will quickly go through the 10 chapters, the 10 tactics of fascism. The first is the mythic past. The nice thing, the reason one always goes back to Mussolini and Hitler is they're very explicit about these things, or Alfred Rosenberg, who was not Jewish. So Rosenberg and Mussolini, sorry, that was a joke. Rosenberg was a major Nazi tactician of the 20s. So Rosenberg and Mussolini, they talk about the usefulness, usefulness of a mythic past. What you're doing in fascism is you're trying to destroy truth and replace it with power. Power works hierarchically, right? So there's the most powerful person, and there's a hierarchy of groups. So there's Fascism Works, where one group has more value than other groups, and then the leader represents that group. So in conditions where people feel anxious, what you do is you tell them that their anxiety is due to the fact that they've lost their position in society due to liberals, due to feminists, due to foreigners, and in the past there was this pure past. You see this very clearly with like the Hindutva movement in India. You see there was this pure past where you were worshipped, you were admired just because of your national identity, just because of your race, just because of your religion, just because of your gender. The mythic past is always hierarchical. It's always patriarchal, because what you're always trying to do in fascist propaganda is you're trying to like invoke these values, these fascist values and patriarchy involves the patriarchal father whose authority derives from his strength, and the leader stands to his nation like the patriarchal father stands to his family. So you're always trying to talk about, you're always trying to like heighten patriarchal sentiment, because then people are like, oh wow, society should be patriarchal. So the mythic past, so Mussolini says in a passage I talk about in chapter 1, and Rosenberg says basically the same thing, the myth of our nation is the glory of its past. So you always have this mythic past that's been lost, and you get people to connect their feeling of anxiety to nostalgia for a past that never was.
The conclusion of Jason Stanley's talk on our program next week. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.